Based on my conversations with people over the last few days and looking at the way some of the models are evolving, it appears that I have made some additional assumptions about relationship mapping that I probably should not have made. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes and go over the fundamentals of relationship mapping in the terms of the way that I perceive them. There are, dozens and dozens of different ways one can map things. In particular, with regard to this project, the relationships are essentially what the systems people call causal loop diagrams, though I really don't care for the term. I just think about them as relationship maps in terms of mapping relationships between multiple things. So in causality, you create an element simply by double-clicking, and I'll just call this A, and I'll create another element, and I'll call it B. And then the question is, what's the relationship between A and B? Well, there are not many. You ask yourself, if A increases, what's the implication toward B? So I go ahead and I draw this, and and the thing disappeared, and it shouldn't have. I can say that it changes in the same direction, meaning that if A increases, B increases. Now, this does not actually imply anything about what happens if A decreases. B could decrease or could stay the same, and I'll talk to you about instances where that could happen and why. It might be that it's opposite, so that if A increases, B decreases. It may also be that I'm not certain about what happens. I think it decreases, but there's a question, so I put fog on it. If I can go ahead and delete the relationship, or I can add a time delay saying there's an appreciable delay between the time that A changes and it actually has an influence on B, and I'll show you in a moment where that in fact might be the case. So let's build a savings account. We'll start with some principal. Savings account doesn't work unless you put money in it, so we probably need some deposits. And we think about the relationship between the two, and as deposits increase, the principal increases. Why is it doing that? Same. Though if the deposits decrease, the principal doesn't decrease, because the principal is something that accumulates, and typically stocks, those things that accumulate, we label them with a capital letter because it's just so we can tell by visually looking at the diagram that it's a stock that accumulates, increases or decreases over time. Now, because it's a savings account, we put money in there because we want it to grow over time. Well, it grows over time because periodically there is something called interest, which is created, but the interest is a function of principal and interest rate. Now, I've labeled this with lowercase because it's something like interest that doesn't accumulate, it changes over time. If it were a constant during the entire relationship time frame, I probably would have made it in all uppercase letters. So let me go ahead and say that as interest rate increases, interest increases, so that the interaction of principal and interest rate creates interest, though typically savings accounts only get interest periodically. So let me go ahead and add a time delay to this, indicating that this doesn't happen continually throughout the time frame. And then the interest then adds to the principal. So as interest increases, principal increases. As interest decreases, the principal still increases because it's a stock and it doesn't go in multiple directions. Unless, of course, you end up with negative interest and then this arrow is decreases and you need some other convention for figuring out how to draw the map. But in terms of a typical savings account, you end up with deposits into an account, which is the principal. The principal interacts with interest rate periodically, and once the interest rate is calculated, it immediately adds to the principal. There's no delay here. Now notice that this became running ants. That's because Causality understood that this is in fact a loop, and if you come over here and look, it'll tell you that it is a loop and it's a reinforcing loop. Reinforcing loops are ones with zero or an even number of opposite relationships. So we've built a savings account. Let's go ahead and now fill a bathtub with water so that I have a current level in the bathtub, which is a stock. The bathtub is something that accumulates something over time. And I have a desired, which is a constant. In other words, I want the bathtub to be full, which is X number of gallons. The difference between these two is actually what might be referred to as a gap. Let me make this a little smaller. So if the desired increase got larger, the gap would get larger. And when the current level in the bathtub increases, the gap gets smaller. But the difference between the two, the gap, causes me to, causes me to open the faucet so that the water flows, and as the water flows, it actually adds to the current level. Now, notice that it also identified the fact that there was another loop here. If you look at it, it says that this is a balancing loop, and we can rename these and we can change the order of them as we see fit. But what it says is that the more open the faucet is, the faster the level increases, and as the faucet, as the level increases, the gap gets smaller, and as the gap gets smaller and smaller, we begin to close the faucet, and the current level approaches, and when it finally reaches the desired level, then we end up closing the faucet, and there is no more flow. So what you have is a reinforcing structure and a balancing structure and a direct relationship, and this happens in instances such as this and this, where you're not actually having that variable be altered in the time frame of whatever it is that you're modeling. The reinforcing structure and the balancing two structures are the only structures that there are. It doesn't matter how complex the relationship model is that you create. It's just some number of zero or more balancing and reinforcing structures merged together. Balancing structures are goal-seeking, which means they should in fact identify what the goal is. You end up from time to time seeing balancing structures in models where the goal is not explicitly identified, and it ends up being confusing, and they refer to them as stabilizing or stagnating loop structures, but nothing is changing the elements of the loop. So nothing is actually happening. It's a confusing construct, and people actually shouldn't do it. Oftentimes you will see instances where, let me take this off here, remove, time delay, remove the fog. You'll see instances where A influences B and B influences A, and they're in opposite directions. Typically when you see this happen, it really ends up that both of these are stocks, and it's a flow from one stock to another, so that as you take water out of the well to increase what's in the water tank, it decreases the amount that's in the well, and these should both be end up being stocks with capital letters. And if you converted this into a simulation model, this would actually be represented by a flow of something from one to the other. So some initial thoughts about relationship mapping. Maybe it's useful, maybe I'm being redundant, and we'll see what happens. Look forward to your feedback. Bye.